Welcome once again to Hyomoto and Julian's Julian Hyomoto podcast on GML. I'm Hyomoto.
I'm Julian.
You'll never guess who's who. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is a really fun topic. Julian is also very passionate about this topic. It's coding style. Now, when you hear coding style, there's a lot of people that are going to have a lot of opinions about it. And of course, we're no different. We have what we believe is best as well. But a lot of it is consistency. If you choose to do something one way, you should always do it that way. Even if you have a god awful, horrible, terrible coding style, you should at least be consistent about it so that when you're when you're looking through it, you can at least rely on the fact that it's horrible all over. The that's that's my pep talk at the beginning here. All right, so we're gonna bring up a few descriptions here to kind of bring it back to GML for a second. GML, what's its prominent case there, Julian?
Unfortunately, it's snake case.
It is snake case. Now, here's the question that you might not know the answer to. Why is it snake case?
Probably because GML used to be mostly global namespace.
Not exactly,
You'd
but
argue?
you're on the right track. If we go back in time, it's because GML was originally written in Delphi. So that's a Delphi coding standard as well as a couple other
Um,
languages.
yeah, that I didn't know.
When you get into things like Java, Java loves its Pascal case, I believe.
C# 2 and Pascal case is the only option I will accept.
And so, what is snake case, Julian?
Snake case is when you have all words lowercase and like word separations are marked by underscores. So wherever you put a space, you instead put underscore.
Yeah, so if you look at like
It's easy.
instant create depth, you'll notice there's an underscore in between all three of those words, and yeah, that's your snake case. So what is Pascal case?
Well, Pascal case is more complex than snake case. Basically, I think all classes are uppercase. Like the first letter is always uppercase, and then you don't separate words. Like in snake case, you just put an uppercase letter again. Um, Variables start with lowercase, but like the next word is uppercase again, and I think that's basically it. It's a little more complex, but really it's easy too.
Yeah, so essentially what we're talking about here is, and when we're talking about these casing, the fact of the matter is you got to read a bunch of words on screen. And so the question is, how do you break that up visually? And it's so different attempt we can't use spaces, right? Because spaces already have somewhat of a meaning
Meaning.
in
Yeah.
programming. They all get removed. So you can't really have a variable with no spaces in it. But it can be very difficult to look at an all lowercase word that was like HTTP request socket identity layer to like that's ugh, that would be really, and that's going to be kind of chunky to look at no matter what. But you put in some underscores and you lengthen it out and you put some breathing in between those words and you can look at it and you can read it a little bit easier. And camel case and Pascal case are very similar. They're all about, instead of putting those underscores in there, you break up the individual words by capitalizing a letter. Now, I believe Pascal is where the first letter is uppercase, and Camel's where the first letter is lowercase. Am I got
No,
that
you're wrong.
backwards?
Other
I got
way.
it backwards. Pascal is when the
Okay,
first
maybe
letter.
maybe we can show examples on screen.
Sure, yeah, I can. I could get some camel case up here.
Well, the reason being snakes are always
Oh
like
no, I
slithering on
was.
the ground, so
Uh,
it's all lowercase. And since snakes are like very long, you don't separate using well uppercase. You just
this is.
put an
We're
underscore.
gonna do
And
a.
camels have like these two things. I don't know what they're called.
So we have
Yes,
our camel
that's how you
case
remember.
right there. Look at that pretty picture I've discovered for purposes of this. Let's look at our Pascal case.
I wonder what that explanation is. Yeah.
There you go. So
Bicycle case is just the odd one out.
this is
We
probably
have
the
heard.
easiest way to look at it. So there you go. Pascal case is where the first letter is uppercase
No,
and
that's
camels.
wrong. No, that's wrong.
I don't know. I think you're backwards. I think you're
No, 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 I'm
backwards.
not. I'm not. I'm not.
Well, let's see here. What is Pascal case? Let's take a look see here.
Pascal case is first letter down.
Pascal case is the first letters uppercase.
Yep. No, 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 because that's a class.
Oh, yeah. Well, camel case apparently says that either is fine. Weird. Anyways, now
And in Pascal case, all classes are uppercase.
apparently
It's
that's what I had left on my screen was an empty window. Anyways. So point is whatever you choose to do, if you want to put underscores and capital letters in between. So I thought it would be kind of fun to talk about. In my case, a lot of people when they're working with GML, they'll follow the GML format, but structs are new in GML, and so
we can break
I use the
through.
Pascal case whenever I'm making constructors because it helps distinguish it from regular functions, right? And that's what it kind of comes down to is you look at that and you go, okay, that's not just a function. Why? Because it doesn't look like snake case. Snake case are functions. These are not snake case, so it must be. That's kind of why I don't. Why I get annoyed at languages like Java and stuff is because while they use this consistent coding style across the entire language, it also means that there's very little visual distinction between what you're writing on the screen. It's very adherent to these specific styles, which can make it a little bit bland to read. And
Yeah, I think this is a very funny topic because a lot of people get very passionate and heated about it. And I made the joke that this is probably going to be the most political thing we're going to talk about.
oh
But
yeah,
I strongly believe that the one case that can be made for Pascal case, why Pascal case is better, it's easy to identify what is a class and what is not a class. You can
oh
see
yeah,
that like at a glance. With snake case and camel case, you can, if you adhere to other naming conventions, which is different to
like putting a word in there,
case
class,
conventions.
snake,
Yeah,
function. Yeah.
exactly. And well, it's not a very objective topic, I'd say, but I think that's one of the most objective things you can say about any of the naming conventions.
Oh yes. And now I'm gonna set the world on fire because I told Julian I would do this, and there's a thing
Yeah, yeah,
called
exactly.
there's a thing
The
called
next
bracket
thing is
style.
brackets.
Yep.
Yes.
So let's say I have an if statement here, and then I have some expression that I want to evaluate. There are generally two different bracket styles. I'm gonna cover this real quick. Yes, some people will do this, and yes, some people will do this, but I'm not talking about
Mhm.
that final
Oh,
bracket. What
no,
I'm
they're
talking
not. They're
about
not.
is what is known as the one true bracket style. And the fact of the matter is there's really only two places that you can actually put a bracket. And so the first case is you can put it here, and it's following the expression. The second case is when you have it on the following line. Now, the reason I wanted to share this was because there's only one argument I've ever heard in this debate that actually makes any sense, and I'm going to share it with you now. The reason why this style has an okay, let's talk slightly about this real quick. The reason this style has an advantage is because it takes up one less line of white space. And when you're talking about pages of code, one empty line like that can very much break up because I've got all this noise right here. When I'm doing this, suddenly I have this big wide open space right here, and it adds a visual openness that a lot of people don't like because it looks like wasted space. So when you put your
Mhm.
bracket up top, it's nice because it gets rid of that one space. Now, some people will tell you that it's better to put here because you can always see your bracket. Okay, sure, whatever. I can also always see my if statement, so it's not like I'm expecting there not to be a bracket there or something like that. But here's the trick. Let's say I turn this into a comment. Julian, what
Oh
happens to this
no.
block right here?
Yeah, that's actually a good reason. But screw you because I think in VS Code there's a shortcut to just commenting out the entire bracket,
Yes,
like the entire thing.
and so if you're not following on what just happened here, is if I had something like a equals 1 there and I have a equals 1 there, if I were to comment out this, I would also have to comment out the other bracket to have this code run right here. But in this bracket style, if I simply do my one comment there. In coding, these blocks, they will run. They don't require an if statement. And so this A1 will still work. And so sometimes when you're debugging, if you want to make sure that your if statement is still working, it can be easier to comment out that first line, and then you'll know. So there's a little bit about bracket styles. I will say I always like to keep my bracket styles lined up, and I think that's important to do because I've tried the other ways where you have the indented brackets, and to me, and maybe it's just because I'm so used to the way that I've used brackets for so many years, but I find it to be very difficult to tell where something ends in that situation, and I screw it up every single time. It's just weird. So I always push mine all the way to the left, and I have them line up with the if statement.
Yeah, same.
And yeah, and so those are kind of like some simple ideas, and perhaps controversial depending on what side of that debate you might fall on. But as part of this other discussion is just language as a whole, right? And that's where coding styles came from. Was code isn't just, a lot of people think that code is how we talk to the computer, but we don't. That's not true at all. I mean, you can run this code, the computer doesn't understand a lick of it. The compiler's what talks to the damn computer. The virtual machine's what talks to the computer. So what your code is more like writing a book or a story. It's how you talk to yourself or programmers. Yes, it's filled with instructions that you want the computer to run, but the computer doesn't know any of those words. The compiler does. And so that behooves you to write your code in a way that, just like if you were writing a letter back home, right? You could use a lot of slang, you could use a lot of, misspelled words, you could use a lot of bad punctuation, and the person who gets it, they might be able to figure it out. But it would be much easier if it was very clear. And I was taught, well, I was never taught to program, unfortunately, but I learned how to program in HyperCard. And HyperCard was interesting because it was all about natural language. You would say, like, put 10 into line 2 of the field. And it was weird because it used the word the. And it had a very distinct meaning in HyperCard. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but it had this ability to write out in very naturalistic language. And you look at GameMaker Studio and you might say, well, that's not possible to do. How do I, it's code. It sounds so computery. How do you make it natural language? And the answer is it definitely totally can be. You can use many of the same speech conventions that you have. One of my favorite examples is, you could have something that says like, if inventory search inventory item get item inventory plus 2 equals less than greater than, and you end up with this just word salad. Or you could write if inventory contains item, and I bet that you can understand that. And I didn't do a magic trick there. I'm not cheating. I'm not using tools that aren't available. I just said I would rather read something that conveys the idea that I'm trying to express. And it becomes much easier when you start plotting out a program. Julien loves doing this. He's always building diagrams and stuff like that. I'm always impressed by his
I
ability.
actually hate it.
I'm always impressed by his ability to do overly elaborate diagrams that won't work. But but the thing is if you, a lot of times what I recommend to people is write down the rules, right? Write down your rules. Like, let's say I wanted to roll a dice, right? I might say, or I wanted to check if a dice was a certain number. I might say, if the dice is equal to this number. Now, that might not be what my code says specifically, but I bet you I can get pretty close. Like, I could say something like, if dice value equals 6. And it reflects that rule I had. It reflects that condition that I wanted this dice to have. And as you build more and more complex systems, you get these more and more complex rules, but they can still be broken down into individual tasks that you have to get done. And when you can write them out in that sort of natural way, and then you use natural language to express your programs, you can find where you screwed up or where the logic is missing. Instead of being like, how do I, where does this go? When did that end? What do I do? Instead, you're like, if inventory contains item, and you're like, all right, well, what was the item? Okay, the item was correct. Then you're like, well, what was what's the inventory? Oh, okay, the inventory's wrong. You only have so many things that can be wrong in this scenario, and suddenly it condenses it down, makes it makes it easier.
Yeah. Speaking about language and how net language, especially like code, should be naturalistic, that's one of the main reasons I love Ruby. Ruby has such nice syntax, I guess, because what Ruby has is first you can overload pretty much every operator. What operator overloading is, if you don't know, basically, well, think of when you add two numbers as the plus as the function. So you can basically change for a class what that plus does for that class. So when you're writing a vector, that you add each component to each to the other component instead of like doing something weird with the bytecode. I don't know. But that's basically what operator overloading is. And in Ruby, you can overload pretty much every operator. And the other thing you can do is you can add an exclamation mark or a question mark at the end of a function. And in the case of the roll dice, I know it's at the same time I hate it, but I also love it. You could do something like dice.rolled question mark and then a six. As a human, that is incredibly readable because did the dice roll a six? It kind of flows naturally. I also hate it because you're not explicitly comparing anything, but because like rolled and then you pass six as the function argument, it's going to return true. It's going to work and evaluate. It's just it looks weird if you haven't done it and if you're not used to it. But that's one of the main reasons I love Ruby. And the other reason with the exclamation mark is basically marks dangerous methods, things that like overwrite what you're calling them on. So if you're doing something on a list, like there's a map function. No, no, no. Actually, map works. So map can either return the list again with every single thing you apply to it. So it's basically, for example, when you say map and then a plus two, and then you just every single number gets two added to it. You either return the list you operated on, so now you have a new list, or when you write a map exclamation mark, it overwrites the original list. And I think that's a very clever way of doing things, and I love it. It's one of my favorite features of Ruby. But I
uh,
think a lot of people hate it.
well, Ruby is kind of funny because it falls into that category of a great idea that was created a long time ago. Now, I'm speaking
Mm.
digitally, of course. A long time ago. Like you look at something like Python, and why, and even though I'm not a huge fan of Python, I do respect certain things that it does well. And one of those things is it tries to make every line of code that you put on the screen matter, and it tries to use language in a way that makes sense when you're reading it. Now, it fails all the freaking time, but in many ways, it succeeds. And it was based on that foundation of like, if you look at Ruby, Ruby is this object oriented language in the most truest of sense, in that everything is an object. Three is an object. True is an object.
Mm.
Some function you're running is an object. Everything is an object in Ruby. It's a very interesting idea, where it kind of gets a little clumsy. Is like I said, it was still built during a time when, uh, to use kind of a phrase that I've seen before, when somebody chooses how to write their code and they say like, "Oh, that doesn't look like professional enough," or "That doesn't look programmy enough," or some ridiculous comment like that, where you're like, "What are you basing this decision on?" Like, that's not how well it runs. That's not how much memory it takes up. Those are important factors. No, instead it's like, I like it to fit smaller on the screen. And you're like, and there are ways to do that don't involve making your code, terrible. Um, there's an example I always give to Julian, and I feel like it's one of the best ones. But it's talking about this. It's a very programmy looking thing where it's asking for some portfolio IDs and some trader functions and getting their permissions, and you look at it and you go, I don't really know what that's doing. You have some idea as a programmer. You go, I got some idea, but then it just inverts it. and it becomes if trader can view portfolio. And suddenly you realize, oh, it's just a permission check. This isn't complicated. This isn't scary. This isn't weird. That other block of code, yeah, it was because it was written by somebody who probably had a weird idea of what the structure of their code should be. In fact, that probably is what they said. They're like, oh, I want this to look really professional or something like that. And it ends up almost having the exact opposite effect because now you have this just horrible to work with code. It's ugly to read. You're constantly having to scan back and forth to even figure out what the hell you were doing. And I had this little, I don't know, epiphany thought, whatever you want to, the other day where I was like, because I hate getters and setters. Uh, Everybody should know that about me. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Um, because if your variable is private, then you don't want somebody to get at it. So why do you have getters and setters? Okay, it's not, it's only partially private. You're like, I still want to set it. I don't want to get it. That doesn't, okay, why? And then you have the other side of it is like, I just want to be able to get it. And okay, fine. But here's my question for you. You end up with this violation of concept when you work with the getter and setter paradigm, which is you might say, object X set value, right? Okay, cool. We set X to that value. Again, we can understand that. We can read that. But let me ask you this. What does object X get even mean? What does that mean? In this context, what are you getting? The 3? Are you getting X? What is supposed to be returned by this? Because you know what you probably want that to say? You probably want that to say is. Fucking object X is. What is X? And then you could actually pass in the value you want to check. Because it's going to be a check, right? Because otherwise you've just violated the integrity of your encapsulation regardless. Because you got the 6. Like, let's say I got my 6 out of my dice. Well, now I can do whatever I want with my 6. There's no truity of state anymore. We've just taken something out of it and we've given it to the whims of context. But if you said like object X is 6, not only do you understand what it means, what you're checking, what you want to know about this, you're also getting back the relevant detail, which is whether or not it was 6. It's there was a description a while ago that somebody gave about it was how to build a recently used list or something like that. And it was talking about how, you could, something you might want to do is you might be like, oh, I'm going to use a list structure. And then I'll expose that list to the user so they can do whatever they want with it. Like maybe they want to sort it. Maybe they wanted this or that. And the funny part about that is it's like, okay, then what's this outer structure for? Just give them a list then. Like, the whole point of writing encapsulation is so that they don't have to know about the list. So the list, it's not there. It doesn't matter. It's all abstracted. What do I do with the recently used list? Well, I put things in it and I take things out of it. Yeah, I love language, but it can be a frustrating topic sometimes. Julian
Yeah,
seems upset.
I still had to figure out what you were talking about with the list example.
Hmm.
Um, what I like to say, and there's obviously a few exceptions, but basically, if someone who has never written code, never read code, can't read your code, it's probably bad code. There's exceptions.
There are
When you're
exceptions.
writing highly optimized code, making that readable is impossible, basically.
Yes,
When you're
optimization
writing good
is
code.
removing all the fiddly bits. So
Mm. But usually you don't need highly optimized code. In GameMaker, you're having highly optimized code. 99% of cases, you're limited by something else that you are not optimizing anyway.
mhm.
So writing optimized code in GML is pointless, except you're to do atoms and you're writing, for example, Scribble, which is almost as fast as the draw text functions. In that case, yes, write optimized code. But there's like, especially in GML, there's so little options to write highly optimized code that when your code is unreadable to a beginner, it's bad code. I will probably die on this hill, and I will not change my mind because like Hayo said, like code is a language that should be read, and it should be read by us, not by the computer. And the computer is going to make sense of what you write. And a compiler usually does a very good job at that, but you're limited by your own ability to understand your code because the computer does what the compiler tells it to do. The compiler does what you tell it to do. And if you don't tell the compiler the correct thing to do, that's probably on you, not on the compiler, because your code is the one that's breaking. It's chances are that when there's a bug, you usually see people like, oh, there's a bug in GameMaker. No, there's not a bug in GameMaker. There's not a fucking bug in GameMaker. There is not ever going to be a bug, except for a few
There
exceptions
are
again.
sometimes, yeah.
But if there's an exception, you know there's an exception.
However, it is
And you're not
important to
like, there's
remember
maybe a bug.
it's unlikely to be the first thing that's GameMaker does have
Mm,
its moments, but
yes.
generally speaking, you know,
Like well, one
your big
time
litmus
I
test
was
is if I deleted this code, would it work? Because I will say there is a bug in GameMaker right now, and it's an infuriating bug that drives me nuts.
oh, there's a few.
It's the file attributes function does not work. They fixed part of it, which is actually kind of neat. I don't remember if I reported that bug or not, but but the rest of it doesn't. But it creates a new problem, which is uh, it will not return a list of directories if you provide it with a file type. But if
Mm.
you don't provide it with a file type, it will return all files and directories, despite the fact that you asked it to return directories. So I guess it's trying to pattern match on directories. I don't know. Yeah, even if you did
Yeah,
star dot star, it'll return directories. But if you did star
in
dot
Unity,
text,
I had a funny thing where I was trying to copy a block of memory because copying memory is faster than copying an array because for an array you
sure.
have to copy the entire thing. So I tried to copy a block of memory from another block of memory, and well, basically, I ended up trying that before the block of memory was set at one specific point, so it caused the entire thing to just fold in on itself. And one might argue, well, that's a bug in Unity because Unity should protect against that. And yes, I will take that case. Absolutely. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't just completely toss the entire thing out the window. It should die on me. But at the same time, I really shouldn't write code that it makes it possible to copy a block of memory when I should copy a block of memory. And if I had written my code more concisely, I would have seen that immediately. And if I had followed language standards, which I did not, I regret it deeply. I would have seen that, and that's kind of what naming conventions are for, and even style conventions, even though we hate them. They're not there for the compiler. The compiler doesn't need your help with understanding the code. You need help understanding your code, and I think that's
That's a good
good
way of
if that
describing it.
thing's in.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And I mean, look, the compiler throws away all the spaces. The compiler throws away all the names. The compiler throws everything away. It's going to convert it into something that the computer can read. The VM can read, whatever it may be. And how much of that it does depends. When you do the YYC, it's going to get rid of it all. It's going to write it into machine language. And when you're in the VM, I actually don't think it, I don't know if it does any optimizations. I assume it does, but I don't know what they are necessarily. In fact, I wouldn't be
Well,
surprised.
there's
Go ahead.
short circuit. It definitely does short circuit if statements, but
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, no,
I
what I
don't know if
mean
there's
is,
anything else.
and I don't know if it takes the scripts we write and it does anything fancy to try to speed them up. Like I was talking to you
But
earlier about the scripting thing that I was working on. It uses a jump table to look for the
mm,
next line that it should go to if it reached the end of a branch. And it's a very clever idea, and I hope it works. I tested it; it seems to work, but it makes me wonder if Game Maker is doing any of that, or if it just has the raw power because the VM is much faster than GML. I have to take every optimization I can get. In fact, I showed this to Julian earlier, but I was using a parsing class that I have in Fast, and I like the parsing class. It's very important. I use it all the time. But in this case, it's just very performance sensitive. And so I ended up writing a simplified parser that only does one thing. It searches for periods basically in variable strings in like a chain of variables so that it can properly walk it, and it does that in the fastest possible way it can by removing everything except for that. And I actually was able to get what did I say? 3,000 more operations in the same time period by making that change. And the funny part is when we're talking about language here, and as Julian had said earlier with the optimization, I actually didn't change any language there because I didn't want to. I didn't want to rewrite anything. So I just wrote a parser that essentially it just slotted into where the other one was, and then do. Now we're done. Yeah, so it's when it comes to optimizing things, and this obviously isn't our discussion about optimizing, but yes, it's like you might think like, oh, smaller code runs faster. No, it doesn't. It's not making any difference. You're like, oh, it's one page of code. I'm like, yeah, well, if you run it 10,000 times, it's still going to be 10,000 slow. It's so you could feel free to write things out very naturally. And I will say this, that's your reason to learn how to use methods, because methods are going to make you're going to make your language so much easier. I would show my
You have to
scripting
take
code, but
this.
no, you wouldn't understand it.
You have to take this with a grain of salt. Because what's quite funny is, for example, in Python, I'm pretty sure that when you're writing a list and want to add elements to it, you can do a loop, like a
Mhm.
for loop. That's pretty fast. It's not slow by any means, but it's not the fastest way. Actually, the fastest way is some weird list comprehension, and you have to like have a special operator in there and a char, and then you do the loop in the list comprehension. It's really weird. I haven't fully understood it. It's fun to read, and it does look like proper programming, if that's a term. It's definitely not readable for a beginner, but it's the fastest way, period. And so, well, this is why this kind of falls apart. Like language is only as good as we can make it to be. Like I just said, the compiler doesn't need your help understanding. That is true. I stand by that. But at the same time, there's a few things the compiler is better at understanding. And if you know those, you should use them in some cases.
Well, this is kind of like
Now,
using a linked list versus an array. If you understand what happens under the hood, you can make an
yeah,
informed decision.
what like people like to say is, well, a good artist follows the rules, but like a master at the craft breaks them. So if you really know what you're doing, go ahead, break the rules.
Actually, I
But
just remembered something that I had meant to bring up here. It was
yeah,
one of our topics. Oh, it was naming conventions, because we were talking
yes.
about a lot of this, and I forgot to mention this because as programmers, we've all been guilty of writing like FTX, right? What is that? What is FTX? What does that
For
mean?
the xylophone.
Yeah, it's and so you end up with a situation where you could end up with code that's full of all these little, let's say, code words. What do they even mean? And I would like to throw the feeler out there that anything that's going to be exposed to a higher level should probably be descriptively named.
Mhm. That is true.
And so like you know, to avoid, if it's going to be quote unquote private, as in you're not necessarily exposing it to other people, if it's all internal, like let's say it's internal to a function. Let's say I have a search function, right? And inside my search function, I have to do a for loop. I can do for I is equal to 0 because that I is only taking place in a small block of code. It's very easy for me to infer what that I is being used for. But here's your alternative. If I'm passing in I as an argument, oh no. What is I? What have I done? Like in that case, like you can put that in your function header, but you'll definitely want to write your js.comments to explain to give it a much more descriptive name and a description, so that later on you don't have to try and figure out what did I mean by I. Yeah, and yeah, spelling things out entirely. Like look, it's very popular idea to believe that you're saving yourself time by shortening things. Like get int, okay? What if get is an abbreviation for something else? Int is often an abbreviation for integer, and you could say like, oh, everybody does that. Okay, fine. If it's a very common coding convention like get float, people are probably going to know what you're talking about. You're probably going to know what you're talking about. But if it's like get win, what does that mean? What does that mean? Get window. Oh, okay, get window. The Remember this too. You're not writing code for yourself today. You're writing code for yourself 2 days from now when you come back and you look at it. What have you done? Yeah, so
Yeah, yeah. That reminds me, one time I was writing a very primitive marching cube algorithm. Um, and it had a lot of single letter variables. And I was trying to refactor it. I didn't have a single idea what I was doing because everything kind of broke. And it's a simple algorithm, but I didn't want to start all the way like again because I wrote most of it, but I had to because I didn't comment anything. I had single letter variables, and
I'll give you another
at the
great
time it
reason to
all
do
made
that.
sense.
Have you
At
ever
the
tried to
time it all
use
made sense,
find and
then it didn't.
replace on a single letter?
Oh yeah, that also is an issue.
that like so I often use the underscore and then a letter, and but if there was ever a reason to use two letters instead of one, it's because it's look, every letter you add is the less of a chance that you're going to get some extraneous hit. And also avoid using names that are already in use. Like if you are working with a function that's called like get script name, probably don't use underscore script as one of the variables in there, just because it's going to clash with a lot of other things. Yeah, it sounds funny. Some of this is like experience based stuff when you're talking about just inside your own head, you're inside your own program. But yes, like Julian said, you have this alphabet soup: HJKLMNOPQRSTUVWXYZZAABB. Where am I going? Yeah, you can get lost in the letter salad in the alphabet soup.
Yeah, my favorite piece of why good documentation is important is the fast inverse square root algorithm, which is infamous for being a very clever piece of code. Um, but at the same time, the only comments the author includes are, I don't have a fucking clue what this is doing, and this somehow works, and then there's a line commented out. It doesn't make sense when you're
Yeah,
trying to read. You really have to understand it.
it
Um,
has to be explained to you, to say the least.
yes, and that is, even though it's ingenious code,
Oh yeah,
it's not good code.
it's
It's
very
not good because you can't understand it.
yeah. At the bare minimum, it could have a slightly better comment than that.
Uh,
Well, oh, it was when I was in Juju's server. One of the guys in there, Nick, is always looking at like decompiled source code from Game Maker
on
Studio,
the
and they
decompiled
actually have a
source
lot of
code also.
comments like that in there.
Yeah, I know.
Like they have a lot of like comments that you're like, the fuck is that? I don't know. Look,
That's
C
very
plus
common,
plus.
I've noticed.
I will say this: C plus plus is not an interpreted language, and because of that, it can be very difficult to write nice, readable, breathable code. GameMaker, we have a nice ability to do that. Python, you have a nice ability to do that. Java, you don't have the ability to do that because Java sucks. But but yeah, but in those situations, you could at least put in like helpful comments. Don't put in a comment like, "I don't know what this is doing," or "What's this for?" Like, I've seen
I
these
think there's
comments.
yeah, yeah, like this is a little bit of a tangent now, but in the Counter-Strike source, I think files, there's an image of I think a coconut or a tomato, I'm not sure. And the comment in the code is basically like we have to keep this in, otherwise it all breaks, and no one has a clue why.
Yeah, yeah.
There's just a PNG of a fruit, and like it has to be in there. And this is obviously again another symptom of like bad conventions because if you had written your code well, you'd probably know why you have to include it,
Oh,
but you didn't,
well,
and there
I
you
know
are.
why they have to include that. You know what it ends up being is it's like it's being so it was in the program somewhere and somebody used it as a reference, and then that reference got used in the particle system, and so the particle and then it's
Mm,
like so you remove that and suddenly you have something breaking in a completely arbitrary part of the program. That is why you do not do coupling. Yeah,
mm.
it would be like, like I'm working on the scripting system. It would be like if it only worked. if there was a certain text file, in the folder.
Yeah.
This text file must be there, or the system breaks. And in that situation, it's funny because the reason is because well, it's just cheaper to leave the coconut in there than it is to try to than to try to A, figure out why it's doing that, and then B, potentially break something else trying to fix it. You're just like, screw it, does it work? Okay, leave the coconut. But yeah, that coconut's a great example of
It's hilarious.
it's a great example of having done something in a way that maybe you regret later on.
Yeah, well, language is a little less of like it's less hands-on as a topic, so we can like kind of only discuss things. We usually discuss things, but this we can really only discuss. But well, the main thing to remember is again, you're writing code not for today, you're writing it for the next week. Sometimes you're taking part in a game jam and you only have like 2 days. You don't have to write comment code, but even then. Like I think Forager is a good example because it was a jam game originally, and well, then people had to work on it again to like make it a selling game. And I know that caused a lot of people great pain for various reasons. I heard it was not very enjoyable in a
Well,
lot
and I
of
can tell
ways.
you this too, and this is pretty funny. This is something you learn with experience. So, unfortunately, you can't just drop this into your program like a magic little dollop of fairy dust. But the fact of the matter is even in a jam game, you can. Sometimes you're just gonna have to put things where they fit. But
Mm,
I once read if your if your code is expressive, you don't need comments, right? Comments
mm,
really only belong in places where it's not possible to easily convey what that code is doing. It's like, would you put a comment above I equals 0? No. What's the comment going to say? Here I'm setting I to 0, right? If we can understand what it is, inventory get item. Okay, I can understand what's going on. I probably don't need to comment that I'm getting this item from the inventory because that code kind of tells the story. But especially when you're working with that more complex or convoluted code. But so when we go back to the jam game, that is kind of your argument for doing it right the first time. And when I say doing it right, I actually don't mean that you need to write perfect code. I mean, I just did the scripting language, and what I spent the last day doing was cleaning it up, right? But I was able to do that because even though some of it is hellish, the parser looks pretty bad, but because it was cobbled together. The fact of the matter is that I still had certain conventions and stuff that I adhered to and ideas that I used consistently. So when it came time to refactor it and clean it up, I mean, like the execution side of things was always pretty clean, but it used to have a lot of messiness and a lot of extra. And boom, okay, now it's just 70 lines or something like that, and yeah, you can kind of buy that from yourself if on the front end, if you don't just say screw it, and instead you go, okay, I'm going to build this nice little encapsulation for my screw it. And that's your big piece right there. Is you can take all your garbage and you don't have to throw it on the floor. You could put it in the trash can. And it's still a trash can full of trash that you need to take out one day, but at least when it comes time, it's just right here. It's all in one place. It's it's a neatly encapsulated chaos.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a big difference between writing proper code and over-engineering code, and I tend to over-engineer a lot, which is not good. Um, some people think it makes them look smart, but really it's one of the stupidest things you can do. Um, well, there again, fine line between over-engineering and under-engineering, but writing proper code is a much different thing because writing proper code is not necessarily about writing extendable.
Yeah, close
You
enough.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, writing code that you can easily extend to like use something else or like have a system that can easily be scaled up. To me, it's about writing code that you can understand in a month when you haven't worked on the project for a month. Um, because the code can still be garbage and not scale, like might not be able to scale it up at all, but at least you understand what it's doing without like pages of documentation, or like usually people don't write comments, so let's just assume people don't write comments. Like you can still understand it if you read it. And sometimes there's no way around writing code that you just don't understand. Like sometimes that's just how it is. Like randomizers are a great example because randomizers I do not understand. It's just code and they're on this it's
Some
on
very
the
smart
screen.
people figured it out, and I'm just
Yeah,
translating it.
I'm just writing this and I like what it does.
I
It's
mean, to be
basically I
fair, that's
picked
kind
up a
of what
shiny rock.
that's those or those binary expression trees. I'm like, I basically understand what it's doing, but at the same time, I'm willing to just press the I believe button because it works. Cool. I actually learned more about it trying to figure something out, but I was trying to make it into a linear, and now I realize why it can't be linear. But I still don't know everything that it's doing, even though I wrote the code, just because yeah, I was reading somebody else's paper on on binary expression trees. But I bring up this again, which is it's like you can still encapsulate it in a way that makes like there are comments in that code for that reason because I'm like, okay, this is doing this is doing that. Because otherwise, going back to it, oh my god, like some of that code is really horrible and should be cleaned up. But even a few comments make a difference. Like I have a comment that literally just says function, and it might seem like a very limited uh, comment, but you would never know that's what that code was doing without that comment. Like it would be horrible. So it's but yeah, the other analogy I would use here is it's like painting. Coding, I always attribute it to being like an art form, and I stand by that. But imagine you wanted to paint a room. If you started next to the door and painted yourself towards the far wall, there's no way to get out of that room without walking across all the paint. And so it's probably better to start at the back wall and do the ceiling and the corners, and then you kind of work your way towards the door. And so you don't end up
I
painting
really don't know
yourself
why you
into a
would
corner.
paint the floor though.
Well, sometimes you got to paint a floor. So what can I say? We'll use mopping as an example. When you're mopping the floor, the
Yeah.
yeah, you just coding is very much the same way. Like, yes, it might be faster to just go in there with the mop and just go ham on the floor, but at the same time, if I have to walk back over it and mop again, I'm not really saving myself time. And that's what you see with jam games a lot. And I'm not criticizing anybody's programming because I've written enough bad code in my time and I continue to do so. It's just the way it is sometimes. This is more a conversation about like why it's good to take that moment and say, "Hey, can I write this in a way that makes more sense, is more understandable?" Because otherwise, yeah, you're painting yourself into a corner. You're gonna have to walk over your freshly mopped floor to get back at your old code, and you just don't have to, and yeah, maybe it would be proper for me to move all of the furniture out of the room and blah 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 blah. But I even if I don't, I can still mop in a way that doesn't destroy everything. It's just the way it is.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, that's
it's
pretty cool.
I
One more
think this
thing I
ends up
wanted
being a
to
very relatable topic because I think everybody has thousand stories of doing shit poorly.
yeah, one thing I did want to mention still is you talked about getters and setters and um for fast there's a dictionary class and well in the context of a dictionary or a hash table get makes sense. It makes perfect sense. We know what getting it means. We know what setting it means. But like it's a dictionary. Does setting or getting really convey what it's getting at? Like I think he used lookup in the end
Hmm.
because you look up things in a dictionary and that makes sense. It's easy to read. And the concept of getters and setters really is, well, I think where I disagree with you is the concept of private and public getters and setters, because that then can be quite useful, especially for large programs. Um, but well, the word get and set is really a little strange because sometimes, yeah, you know what it means. It makes perfect sense because we read it so much. But like on from a perspective from like language, when you're reading the code, it doesn't make any sense at all. In a lot of cases, it doesn't make any sense at all. And
I have an example for
yeah,
this, which is really funny, and I
yeah,
think you'll
okay,
enjoy
okay,
it.
sure,
The
sure.
So if your wife asked you to set the table, what is she asking you to do? Well, you're German, you might not know this one, but when you set the table, you're going to put a tablecloth on it. You're going to put,
Yeah,
plates,
I was trying to
silverware,
figure out
etc. But here's the
proper
question:
response.
if she asks you to get the table, what is she asking you to do?
Bring her the table.
Yes, she's asking you to bring her the table here. And that's the irony of the whole get set paradigm is that they're not opposites of each other and they don't mean anything remotely the same. Getting and setting a
Mm.
table is not the same activity. And that's why it feeds into my hatred of this paradigm so much is that is the words rarely make sense. Now, I would argue this, and this is kind of goes into this whole language thing. The reason why you know it and I know it and many other people know it is because it's a programming
Mm. Yeah.
paradigm. But if I sat you down in front of somebody's code and it said something like, port get, like what would that mean in that what am I getting? Am I getting something off the network? Am I getting the port itself? Am I getting the object that is the port, or am I getting a number for a port? God only knows, because it's such an inferred context that we would expect that it means, oh, I'm going to get the value of port because programming, and we've done it so many times. And this is part of the reason I wanted to have the language conversation as well, is because the fact of the matter is if you go back far enough, as I was showing Julian a while back, you can crack open a copy of Algol 68, and it has get and set in there. But the opposite of get is put. It's referring to reading something from a reel or a disk drive. You're getting something from the drive. You're putting something on the disk. In the case of set, however, you are setting a value or you are unsetting a value, because there's no reason to get a value, because if you wanted to get the value, you would just use the value. So yeah, the reason I bring that up is because a lot of conventions, they're very old, but some of them are very new. And at the end of the day, it was because somebody sat down, had a conversation like this, and said, hey, I think this is a better idea, or I think this makes more sense. In fact, after I had that conversation with Julian about dictionaries and the whole lookup thing, I realized, like, dictionary is a horrible name for a hash table.
I still disagree on that, but yes.
Because a dictionary implies the ability to read and search. In fact, what I realized is what they call that? They call that an ordered dictionary. And I was like, oh, you mean as opposed to all the just randomly laid out unordered dictionaries that this world has in it? Yeah, last I checked, all dictionaries are ordered on purpose. The only in computers, because some asshole sat down one day and was like, "Oh, this is this is a diction. I call this a dictionary," and I'm like, "I call you a prick."
It still makes sense to me, and I will still disagree on that because you read things from a dictionary
Yeah,
and look
but
up
not from a
things,
hash
which is the
table.
same thing.
From a,
But let's not get into that discussion.
the because okay, so I don't quite remember this, but it's because the hashing method that underlies how the objects get put in the table is different in the dictionary than the hash table. Supposedly it's better for
Uh,
some reason. I don't know what that reason is because I only read a little bit into it. But that's why they gave it a new name, was because they're like, "Oh, we already have this hash map. We have this hash table. Well, here's this new one. What do I call it? Oh, it'll be a dictionary." But the funny
yeah,
part about it is
I
from a
think hash
language
table is too
perspective, it
good.
sort of implies more than, I mean, like, that's like saying, oh, this dictionary is made out of balsa wood, so I'm going to call it a hash table. It's like, no, it's still a dictionary, or it's either a dictionary or it's not. And I
I
think
still
that,
think hash table is wrong because table implies like multi-dimensionality,
I think,
like in a table.
and yeah, and
See,
I
this
agree
is
with
why
that. It's hard to say
language is
with
such
that
a
when
funny
you run
thing.
you run into the limitations of language sometime. I think I called it a hash map, is what I think I called it in. Let me see. I have to
Yeah,
check now.
but the hash map I hate too.
Yeah, I called it
Because
hash
to
map.
me, a map doesn't make sense at all.
Well,
Like
it's a map of
map
hashes,
is
and that actually does make sense because what is a map? A map is directions to find something, And so this is a map of hashes. So what is it? It's a map of directions to hashes. And actually, I can agree with that. I think that's a reasonably good name. Here's our
Oh,
here's our
very good
discussion
memory.
portion.
But yeah, this is why language is a fun topic, but also I hate it because I oftentimes find myself sitting down and just looking for names for things for like a week. And then I remember, especially because I'm not a native speaker, then I remember that there's a word for that. And I was looking for something for like one time I was looking for the word, I think it was team for
Okay.
3 months. I just didn't know it. I completely forgot the word team existed. I was using party, affiliation, group, and everything, and it didn't make sense. I was like, there must be a word for that. And
There's got to be a better word. And
then
actually,
someone just like team,
that actually
and
speaks
team
to
is
the
so
value
bad.
of
But
having a diverse vocabulary, because then you can actually reach for a good word that represents what you want to do. You don't have to rely on something like get and set, because
yeah,
you're
but
lazy.
on the other hand, that's I think there's links showing between programmers being good at not only math, which makes sense because when you're programming, you usually need to know math, but also language skills because when you're programming, you need to learn to express yourself in a concise way that makes sense, at least when you're a good programmer. Um, and that obviously transfers to like everyday skills because you'll start expressing yourself more concisely because um, I don't know if the joke translates, but there's a German joke that's basically your wife tells you to I know I lost the joke. But
It's a good joke. It's a good joke.
thank you. The joke is basically that it's very ambiguous when someone tells you like do something and then or no I don't remember the joke. I think it was go to the store and if they have eggs buy an like avocado or something. I don't know. Aubergine. I don't remember. But the joke was basically the husband checks if eggs and then buys the fruit, but doesn't buy the eggs, which was implied he should buy, but it's very ambiguous. So it
Yes.
doesn't make it isn't as funny when I explain it, but I
Well,
forgot the joke.
it's still you do see this a lot because speaking of kind of language on an adjacent topic is we help out in the chat and answer questions, and there's a fair amount of time when the question simply comes down to a lot of implied
Mm.
outcome. Why doesn't this work? Well, because it doesn't say to do the thing that, obviously that's going to be the answer. That's it's not the mean answer to say because it does, did you write what you wanted it to do? But it is that trick of implying, like I said with the dictionary, it sort of implies that you can search it, right? Like when you're looking up a word, you might want to see the next word or the previous word. You don't the dictionary isn't just like here is your word. And so you end up with this thing where you're like, and this is when people are first starting out and stuff, but you might be something like if place meeting with other is equal to true, and it's just a completely nonsensical phrase that sentence that grammatically kind of makes sense. You can understand the logic that they were going for, like, oh, the other. But you're like, what is other in this context? What is it you're asking the computer to do? And you're like, well, why isn't it working when I click on it? And it's like, well, because because there's a lot of implication going on in what you've written here, but there's not a lot of actual hard computer, please do these things, and like you're saying with the grocery list, it wasn't like buy eggs, buy avocado, buy this. And so instead you were like, oh, I just came home with the last item on that list. Hey, is this sufficient? Of course not. Of course it's not.
Sometimes it's really difficult answering the questions because when you read the code, it's just like, why doesn't this work? And you read the code and it works. And sometimes I have a really hard time understanding what the people want, like what they expect the code to do, because sometimes it's not at all what they're telling the code to do, which sometimes breaks down to GML's documentation being awful. Matthew is fortunately free from that. But one example I have myself is I was trying to copy a DS list, and the DS list copy function. I don't. Yeah, I think it returns whether or not it was successful or something like that.
I
But
believe so.
basically, I was assigning my list to the S list copy because I expected the S list copy to return the list it copied, and it just didn't work out. It always indexed the wrong list because lists are like
I had to
how the
fight with
references
that.
pull number.
Yes, because
It's just
GML has a
painful.
horrible habit of being very inconsistent about that. Like all
Mhm.
the array functions operate on the originating array, but all the, but like array
It's
create
inconsistent
returns
even
an array.
inside the systems. Mm.
And so it does create kind of like a problem because, what you might want to do is say like array is equal to array copy, and then you would put like a blank array and then zero, and then you take the other array. But you can't do that because you have to create the other array first. And this is actually gets a little bit into functional versus, well, just functional programming because in fast, that's why everything in fast actually returns a new value, period. Nothing operates on the internal list unless it's something that has to. Like if you said push to this list, okay, it's not going to return a new list. It could. That would be a very functional programming way of doing things, but it doesn't. So there are a few times where it sort of implied that it will operate on the list that it does. But like when you do a sort or a filter, no, it returns a brand new sorted list. It returns a brand new filtered list. It returns a brand new intersection. And for a while there, I kept fighting with that idea, but then I decided no, you have to pick a convention. And my convention, it's a more functional one in that case, where it will return a new item, and the documentation will make it clear that it returns a new item.
Mm.
The
Yeah, I think this kind of circles back to like if you're going to have a language standard, be consistent with it. This language standard is okay. I can agree with that. I like it actually. But like GML standard is inconsistent even in its own systems, like
yeah,
the DS lists and arrays. And it's okay if there's one standard, even though I might not agree with it. That's perfectly fine, but it's not consistent. That's incredibly makes it incredibly difficult to work with and
it can
unfun
make
too.
it very weird to work with because you have to consult back to the documentation frequently because you're like, what is my expectation for this? What does this return? Does it return undefined? Does it return -1? Does it return an array? Does it return nothing? Like array copy returns nothing. It
Mm.
it's like it, all the other array functions return something, but this in this case it returns nothing. Okay, fine. And or inconsistencies, and like you have all, like for a long time we didn't have array sort. We just had DS list sort. So a lot of people would choose lists just because they wanted to sort. And I'll put this kind of here at the back end because we'll shut her down here in a moment. But that's kind of the other little wackiness is don't choose something simply because it does because it seems to do what you want. All code can do anything. Sometimes it's just a matter of wrapping it up in a useful way so that you don't have to worry about it. But yeah, the big takeaways I'll offer today are yeah, always write for yourself tomorrow. Write for somebody else. It's easy to be like, well, I understand what I wrote. Yeah, well, you've been looking at it for like 20 minutes or 20 hours or 20 days, and so of course you have some idea of what it does. But if you stepped away from it for 3 weeks or you showed it to somebody else, would they have any idea what it does? Um, yeah, and it's worth it. It really is worth investing that little bit of time there just for your own sanity. It just makes it easier to work with. What do you got, Julie?
Yeah,
What's your
yeah,
closing
yeah.
thought?
They basically took the words out of my mouth.
Ha
Just
ha!
assume you're actually as smart as you think, but rather the most stupid person in the room and write for that stupid person. Because chances are it's better to assume you're stupid than it's better to assume you're the smartest.
Hey, it'll make it easier
Usually.
on you too. Like, do you really
Uh,
want to write? This is what I gave Julian crap for. His code was very novel, but it ended up being you have to write these long strings of
that
very
was a good
complex.
reason for that.
There may have been a good reason for that, but my point it still remains is
I
you had
think
to
so
write
too.
these long strings of stuff to make it work, and it's hard to remember. It's well, I mean, you
It's
work with
always
it,
the
so
same thing. It's not hard to remember. I've read it on macros.
it's hard to remember. Because
It's
tomorrow
not.
you write something that works differently, and oh, all that knowledge is gone. Anyways,
Yeah.
that this has been our, I believe this is our sixth podcast. We've been talking about language conventions, I guess, kind of vaguely.
What kind of?
And
Yeah.
and this is I've been Hyomoto.
Open Julian.
And hey, we'll see you next time. Bye.